The gospel reading that Carol read for us this morning picks up right where we left off last week. This is one of those fun sermons where we just picked up where we started last week. And if you missed last week's service, it's online. You can find it on the church website. Immediately, though, when we go to last week's reading, we have to remember where we left Jesus. And Jesus, if you recall from the story of the widow's mite, is maybe the way we were originally taught the story is praising this poor widow for giving her last 2 cents, saying, look at her, this woman of virtue, this woman of faith. Let's all adore and be like her. But I suggested maybe we think of it another way. Imagine Jesus being saddened, frustrated, even angered that the temple structure, that all of the other faithful believers would allow this poor widow to get to a point where she has to give the last of everything she has. The poverty that this widow endures is because others in the church, others in the temple have neglected her in her time of need. So the Jesus that I left you with last week is a Jesus who is fighting back tears, a Jesus who is hurt to his very soul to see one of God's faithful in such a time of trouble with no one helping her. And the fact that the temple leadership and all the religious authorities would even allow it to get to this point for this woman has Jesus in a state of such sadness and discouragement. Remember, the entirety of God's law hangs on 2 commandments. Do you remember the 2 commandments? The most important commandment of all is love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your strength, all your mind, all your soul, with everything you are. Love the Lord your God. And the second commandment is somewhat like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's right. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. So seeing a neighbor in need and not stepping up to help, this is a violation of that commandment. It's a sin to see someone in need and to do nothing about it, to not help. And the poor widow we see in the temple in last week's reading is an example of how those in power, how those in a position of means who have the ability to help have ultimately failed to abide by that commandment. They have failed to demonstrate God's love to someone vulnerable and less fortunate than themselves. And that's the lesson that we have to wrestle with as we realize our world today works very differently. We live in a society today where we very frequently see the poor and the less fortunate as somewhat deviant or lazy. Whose fault is it that the poor are poor? That's something that we have to wrestle with as Christians, because our world teaches us that if someone is poor, it's their own fault. It's their own fault for showing lack of initiative. Maybe they've made some bad life decisions. Let's be honest, sometimes we make decisions that have bad economic outcome. There is some truth to that. Maybe they just don't want to work. Have you heard that lately? I've seen this floating around on Facebook. Maybe those who are poor stay poor because they just don't want to work. Maybe, this is where Jesus challenges us, maybe they're poor because we don't help them. This is a tough lesson in our world today because, like I say, in our world, we blame the poor for being poor. We say it's their lack of initiative, it's their lack of drive, and we demonize the poor for not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. We forget that we have this call, this commandment to care for those who are in times of trouble, whether they deserve that care or not, because truthfully, how many of us deserve the love that God gives us? It's our burden for allowing someone in need to remain in need. It's our responsibility when we see someone in need to help them back to their feet. That's what Jesus teaches us in last week's reading, and that's the bedrock of where we go this week. Because in this way, in the way that Jesus teaches us, the responsibility of caring for the poor widow we see at the temple is everybody's shared responsibility. The temple in Jesus' day was the very sign and symbol of God's presence in Jerusalem, similar to a cathedral or a church building today. So of all places for someone to be neglected, surely it wouldn't happen in the temple. This would be like someone in need coming into the church, and church people, of all people, not helping. You can understand why Jesus was so sad and so upset by this. One of the challenges with the temple crowd in Jesus' day, and I think it's something we can understand, the temple was the focus of worship. It had become not just the symbol of God's presence, but it had become the object of worship itself. It was much more than a building in very many ways. It was the very symbol of faith for the Jewish people. It was the symbol of God's strength in the city. It was a holy and sacred place, not just where people worshiped God, but where God was celebrated. It was not just a symbol, though. It was, according to Jesus, all going to come crumbling down, which was very problematic for people. If you can imagine the scene as we reflect on what Carol read for us today, immediately following last week's reading, immediately following this encounter with the widow who's given the last of everything she has, Jesus laments about how the religious structure that this woman was trying to help contribute to had ultimately failed her and others like her. Jesus and the disciples then leave the temple. Scripture tells us they go out so Jesus can pray. And if we think about last week's reading and this week's reading together, you can see why Jesus would be discouraged and decide to go out to pray. So as they're leaving the temple, going out to the Mount of Olives so Jesus can pray, one of the disciples, an unnamed disciple, probably because nobody wants to embarrass the poor fellow, says, "Wow, would you look at these magnificent walls? Would you look at the beauty of this place?" Now think about this for a minute. Jesus has just been hurt in his very soul because the temple and everybody in it has let down a woman in her time of need. And one of the disciples says, "Isn't this place cool? Isn't it magnificent?" Read the room, right? This is a disciple who can't quite catch what's going on here. The temple had become such a powerful symbol of the religion in that day that the temple itself is what people were finding themselves in awe of. And it was an awe-inspiring structure. You can imagine the size, the grandeur. We know from archaeology that some of the walls of the temple, the outer walls, the stones were 8 to 12 feet in width. And as I look at our posts here on the side of the room, imagine 8 to 12 feet. That's about the distance between two of those beams. And the temple stones could be as much as 35 feet high. I don't know how high that is. Frank, how high do you think it is from floor to ceiling there? Is that about 35 feet? I think that's it. Imagine then, from beam to beam, from floor to ceiling, that's the size of one stone that makes up the outer wall of the temple. And when you look down upon the temple from the Mount of Olives, it gleams in the sunlight. Washed limestone glows bright white as the sun hits it. And the disciples look at this and say, "Wow, isn't that spectacular? Isn't that beautiful?" They can't see the structure that allows the poor to continue being poor. They can't see the neglect that happens instead of the servanthood. They see those walls and they say, "Wow, this is amazing." And Jesus says, "You know what? Every single one of those walls is going to come crumbling down." This had to have broken the disciples' heart, because the temple, it wasn't just a place of worship. In a chaotic Jerusalem, in a chaotic world where Rome was always inflicting its will upon the Jewish people without any regard to their real welfare, in a world where followers of Christ, followers of God, were becoming battered and beaten and persecuted, and times of trial, in a world where everything just seems to be going in every which direction, the temple provides a sense of stability and consistency. And those massive stones meant that there is something that can't be moved. That's a symbol of God, something that will last forever. Forever. Like that song that seemed to go on forever this morning. Forever. The problem is the temple didn't go on forever. History teaches us that Jesus' words actually came to be. Not long after Jesus was crucified and resurrected, about 30 years or so after Jesus' death, Jewish people decide they have finally had enough of their Roman occupiers. They were tired of being told what to do by Rome, so they were going to stand up for themselves. They mounted a coup to overthrow the Roman government within Jerusalem. And boy, did that go badly for the Israelites. Rome not only defeated the Israelites very quickly, but Rome said, "You know what? We're going to teach you a lesson. We're going to teach you that you don't stand up to us again." And the Roman military and government destroyed that temple. They knocked it down. Every single wall. Not one stone was left upon another. That happened in the year 70 AD. Wouldn't you know that Jesus' words came to be when when he said, "This temple will not stand. This temple does not last forever. These stones will not be left." The temple did come crashing down. But it wasn't just the physical structure of the temple that was destructed in 70 AD. That wasn't the only thing demolished. When the temple was destroyed, the whole structure of the religious system was destroyed. The whole structure of scribes and Pharisees was destroyed because all of that was linked to the temple itself. The religious way of life had to be changed for God's followers because no longer was their faith tied to a building, to a temple. Now they had to discover where to hitch their wagon of faith. Where could they find God if not in the temple? For a very long time, God's faithful had come to count on the temple, and only the temple as being their place to encounter the divine. They found safety and security in the walls of the temple. When the rest of the world seemed like a bed of sin, I heard that a couple of weeks ago. The world around us is a bed of sin. The church is our safety. The church is our security. I think if we look carefully, Scripture teaches us that God is our safety. God is our security, not the church, not the building itself. But this was the challenge for those first century believers. They had come to latch their faith onto the temple itself. Like I said, in a topsy-turvy world of chaos, that massive structure provided a sense of stability and security. And when the temple was destroyed, everything changes for God's people. Everything, including the way people worshiped God, the way people talk about God. It all changes. Life itself changes. And you know when you have a massive change in your life like that, no matter how much you try, there's no going back. The only way is to go forward. Now, of course, I realize in many ways I'm preaching to the choir here, right? This is a congregation whose building burnt down. How many years ago, Matt? 30? I'm putting you on the spot in front of everybody. So, 24 years ago, the building burnt down. First Baptist Church of Highland burnt to the ground. The walls were not left standing, very much like the temple in the first century. And I imagine that there were people who were so discouraged and so disheartened by that because, let's be honest, even in our world today, the church building has become a symbol of our faith. It's a symbol of security. It's a symbol of what we believe. It's a place of consistency, a place that is not shakeable. It's a place that no matter how topsy-turvy the world gets, we know we can come in these doors on Sunday morning and we're going to find comfort. We're going to find that God is here. And sometimes I think we, even ourselves in today's world, forget that we can find God everywhere, not just here. This was the lesson for the disciples in our reading today. For a very long time, the disciples themselves had come to count on the temple as the place where they encountered God. And sometimes it takes the destruction of wrong thinking before we can move forward into a new way, like the disciples had to do, of realizing that God lives not in the temple, but in our own hearts. We are in God's presence everywhere we go. Whether we're in the church or out, every step you take throughout the day, you are in God's presence, and there's no direction you can walk where God is not beside you. Like I said, I know I'm preaching to the choir, right? We all know this. After Jesus describes the impending destruction of the temple, he goes further. He doesn't stop there. It's kind of like those old infomercials. But wait, there's more. It won't just be the temple that gets destroyed. The disciples are told what else they should expect. In his response, Jesus focuses on issues of deception. He talks about times of turmoil, times when people will be easily deceived. He talks about chaos, impending chaos. And this is interesting because throughout all of our Gospels, Jesus doesn't often get very apocalyptic in what he says, but in today's reading, he does. This is one of those very rare occurrences where Jesus talks about end of times type stuff. And some common images or themes emerge, things that we've always kind of in our minds come to associate with end of time images, things like destruction, things like coming undone, the world around us coming undone. There remains something hopeful, though, about what Jesus says. He tells us that even as what appears to be the end comes to be, it's not really the end, right? Jesus says this is only the beginning of something else. This is not pain, these are birth pains. The temple will be destroyed. Not one stone will be left standing upon the other. Jesus prophesies this to his disciples in our reading. And it will seem as though the end has come. It will seem as all hope is lost. It will seem as though there's just no point in moving forward. I'm sure it seemed that way to the disciples and to God's faithful when they did see the temple come crumbling down. Maybe there were even those feelings among this congregation when the old church building burnt down. Feelings of utter discouragement, feelings of why bother going forward? Guess this is the end of First Baptist Highland. This happens in our relationships too. When a loved one dies, when a marriage ends, we can experience feelings of despair, hopelessness, and we can wonder how tomorrow will ever even come, or why should we even bother if it does? In times of crisis, time seems to stand still. We can become battered by fear, and looking toward tomorrow can seem downright impossible when we're burdened so heavily with what's going on today. Jesus tells his disciples that there will be times of crisis. There will be times of disappointment. There will be times of destruction. Of that you can be sure. There will be social crises. There will be crises of the human heart. There will be crises of our own making. And there will be crises in the world around us. But I'd like to submit to you that in this reading today, Jesus is not preparing his disciples for the end. He's preparing his disciples for the beginning of what's next. And that's an important distinction to make. This is a new beginning. A new beginning, complete with new challenges and new opportunities. This is a lesson of faith. Wherever we find our comfort and our assurance, there our faith will be also. The disciples had found their comfort and their assurance in the temple itself, instead of in God. Wherever we find our comfort and our assurance, that's where our faith is. And God calls us to find this comfort and assurance in him, and in him alone, not in any structure that we build to symbolize God, but in him alone. The disciples had found their comfort and assurance in a physical building. But you know what? The temple, it doesn't last. It was not forever. We're reminded, though, that of all the things that do fall away, one thing lasts forever, and that is our faith. God lasts forever. Our faith lasts forever. Like that song that went on and on forever, and that's the theme today. Forever is the word bank word of the day, because God's love endures all things and lasts forever. Our faith is not in the temple, which will fall away. Our faith is not in a church building, which someday will crumble, just like every other building. Our faith is not in an institution or a bureaucracy or hierarchy, like an organized religion. Our faith is in God himself, which endures and lasts forever. No matter how the world may fall apart around us, our faith in God lasts forever. And this is an important lesson, I think. I'm reminded as I contemplate these things of watching my children play with Legos. I've got a couple of boys who love Legos, and I've got a couple of feet who hate stepping on Legos. You ever stepped on a Lego barefoot? That'll cause you to cast up a prayer or two, because the first word is usually God. God, oh, why is that there on the floor? In order to build something new with Lego blocks, you have to take apart what you've already built. That can be hard, because when you've built something that you're really proud of, the last thing you want to do is break it all down and take it apart. But in order to build something new, you have to take apart what you've already built. And this is what I see God doing with the temple. This is what I see Jesus preparing his disciples for all those years ago, and even still today. If it seems like the world is coming undone around us, if it seems like the church is falling apart at the seams, I don't think this is the end. I think this is God preparing us for what's next. I think just like those Lego blocks that have to be torn down so they can be rebuilt into something else, some of the turmoil and crises we endure in our lives are just the birth pangs preparing us for what is to come. I know it's very tempting to long for the old days of comfort and familiarity, and I guarantee it was for the disciples too. But today, I'm reminded that life isn't what it used to be, and this is very often because God is still creating something new, something that awaits us, something that we can look forward to. And we have hope and faith in a God who lasts forever, that tomorrow God will be waiting for us there too, showing us something new and exciting, giving us new challenges and opportunities, new ways to follow him. This is what is to come, something that lasts forever. Amen.
Amen.